Hello, this is Unsung, and in today's video, I kind of wanted to dispel a couple of myths about Samira's current itemization and help you get on the right track for itemization by yourself. So, with patch 13.10, ADC itemization has received a full rework. There is a couple of big winners and a couple of big losers. Samira is kind of net neutral on this patch. She's still in a pretty bad state because of the nerfs that have been dealt to her, as well as the big meta shift that's happened, and some of the systemic changes to the game have just kind of pushed her out. Samira's runes have been nerfed, her items have been nerfed, and her ability to proc lifesteal has been nerfed, which compounds into a overall really gutted champion. Now, I'm still seeing a lot of great success with this champion. I think that there's a lot of build diversity for her now, which is pretty nice. However, basically every time you play Samira, it's going to be more optimal to play another character. So in today's video, I'm going to be giving you a whole bunch of different build options, a whole bunch of build explanations, and explaining what items are good and which items are not good, and kind of dispelling some myths that the community has. So first and foremost, what I want to talk about most is lethality Samira. I've been getting bugged about this nonstop, and let me tell you, this build is straight up garbage no matter which way you slice it. So this is one of the popular builds. Yomo's Ghostblade is obviously the most broken item in the game currently. This item more than likely will end up getting hotfixed or at least hard nerfed in 13.11. So as of right now, this item gives you a massive amount of lethality. So the greatest way that we can calculate the amount of damage that a lethality item gives is by hitting a target with some armor. Most AD carries in the late game have around 100 armor and around 2000 HP, give or take some, right? So lethality is obviously a stat that's geared more towards early game. However, lethality has one gigantic pitfall about it. Lethality has a scaling based off of your enemy's level, so you get more value from lethality based on what level the enemy champion is. If you buy a lethality item level 1, you only get 60% of the total armor penetration that you should be getting because the enemy has not leveled to the correct place, right? So lethality basically has its greatest value at about level 11 to level 13 mathematically. There's a big disconnect with Samira players and the value of like Ghostblade and lethality as a whole. Going full lethality isn't good unless you're able to combine it with crit. And the reason for this is that crit is a straight up double of your damage, right? Whenever you critically strike, you deal double damage, which is really valuable on Samira because Samira has a bunch of crit scalings. This is the most important part of Samira. However, Samira's crit scalings are even more important with something like Infinity Edge because Infinity Edge has a unique scaling on both her Q and her ultimate, meaning that Infinity Edge will always be our highest theoretical damage item no matter what build we actually opt into. So let's do a quick damage test here. This dummy has a grand total of 2000 HP and 100 armor and magic resist, which is like the perfect formula for determining effective health. Basically, effective health is the mathematical equation that shows how much damage we're actually going to be landing on a target per auto attack, right? So each auto attack will take a larger or lesser percentage of the enemy's HP based on their total effective health. This target has a lot of effective health because of the total amount of armor and health that it has on it. So let's go ahead and test our damage real quick. Let's just do a standard combo, which is going to be auto into EQ auto, which is going to be the highest damage that we're able to get with this build because we proc our Yomu's Ghostblade, and this is also our regular burst damage combo, right? As you can see, we have dealt basically nothing in terms of damage. We'll do it one more time just for consistency's sake. All right, so auto, EQ, auto. Once again, we have basically the same amount of damage. That time we got kind of lucky with the crit. We dealt a grand total of 1251 damage. Now I'm going to simply just swap my mythic item right now, and let's see how this damage changes. This is with no armor penetration. This is just with an Infinity Edge mythic. We dealt the exact same amount of damage. However, we will have far significantly better scaling with this build. This is without us getting lucky on the crit either. You could see that once again we're dealing around the same damage. This build path, however, scales much harder into the late game and is so much more effective. As you can see there, we got lucky with the crit and we actually outdamaged the lethality build. Now if we actually built the proper item here, which would have been Shiv or Stormrazor, let's go ahead and test the damage again. Auto, EQ, auto. You could see that our damage becomes a lot more consistent. We have a 1167 right there, which is basically the same as lethality. Go again, auto, EQ, auto. Now we have 1025, which is the exact same as before. Now let's go again. And we have 1026, which is once again the exact same as before. However, with this build, our DPS is going to be significantly higher because we have more attack speed. Having more attack speed makes our on-hit DPS significantly stronger as well as stacking our ultimate. Our ultimate also has a crit scaling innately built into it, so having this 60% extra crit will mean that our ulti actually deals more damage with this no matter what, even if we go a full lethality build. So if we do a full 6-item build with the regular crit path that has static Shiv instead of running Stormrazor just for animation cancelling's sake, let's go ahead and look at our damage now. once again, our ulti DPS is significantly higher. If we do that same combo, where it's auto into EQ auto, you could see that we dealt a total of 1433 damage without Shiv proc. And now with Shiv proc, we auto EQ auto into 1722 damage. This damage is even greater if we build Stormrazor. If we go Stormrazor, which has an 80 scaling on it, and we build this sort of build, which is a pretty standard 80 build for Samira, if we do the same combo, we're going to see significantly more damage. As you can see, 2044. Now once again, 1747. Now one more time. 2044. If we look at my stats, I'm playing Samira, which is a champion that gets significantly more armor than other carries because she does actually build plated steel caps. I have a grand total of 172 armor and 2400 HP. One additional auto attack would kill me here. Now let's do this one more time. Auto EQ, auto, auto. Oh, I'm dead. So crit build is going to always be superior in terms of damage. However, the survivability will leave a little bit to be desired. Basically, every single AD carry this patch has been net nerfed, so this is why our itemization is so important now. That is the difference between crit and lethality. Now let's go between item and item. So as you can see here, our first shot was Stormrazor build. This is a grand total of 698 damage. Let's go hit a dummy without any resistances. As you can see, this says 1233, and this lines up with the math that is there, right? There's a percentage damage reduction here, and then this, of course, helps us pen high armor targets, right? So this is with this item. If we swap back to Static Shiv, let's go and look. 1233, 698. So we'll auto this. 614, less damage. However, we have the wave clear and reset potential from this item. Okay, now let's auto this guy. You could see we have 1070 here. So this is significantly less damage. However, the item is just as good because it allows for this chain lightning effect, which is really nice for resetting your damage during a team fight. If you get an extra reset, this is of course more passive stacks, which is very, very, very strong, and also it gives us a good stat line for skirmishing in lane. This item is most consistent with old mythic items, right? We have basically the same stats as old shield bow, except we have this energized attack now. So this item is basically the shield bow replacement if you want to do a full damage glass cannon build. Stormrazor will be a little bit more damage, however you do lack attack speed from this, making your all-in a little bit weaker. When you take an extended fight, having a high DPS is really important because this allows us to actually stack our Conqueror. So if we actually end up going in with this build and we auto EQ, auto W, auto Q, auto, and then alt, we max out our Conqueror pretty easily, right? And we have a huge amount of DPS. However, this takes significantly longer if we just swap this out for this, just for you to see. Our total DPS on this is 1497, and of course this can be sped up. I was kind of sloppy with the animations, now let's do it again. And you can see that our damage is a little bit lower. Of course, I was sloppy-er with the animations on that one, but basically this item is going to be significantly worse for DPS. Whenever you're out of your ultimate and you're bouncing from person to person, you'll have less overall DPS because this simply has less attack speed, and attack speed scales within itself, right? So if we have 40% attack speed with this, and we E onto this target, we have 1.4 attack speed, right? 1.45. Now if we simply just swap our item, and then we do the same thing, we're at 1.52, so this is of course going to be a DPS increase even if the item's active is a little bit lesser. This will just kind of flatten out our damage. So basically, in my opinion, the two items that you want to be building are going to be Shiv and Stormrazor as a first item. There is an alternative build where you can actually skip this completely and you can go straight into Collector. However, I think that this build is inferior for two reasons. First and foremost, Collector is an early game item that is kind of gimped early game, simply because of how it actually functions, right? Lethality, once again, only gives you 60% of its effectiveness in the early game. So if we auto-attack somebody like this, we do a lot of upfront damage, however we're really lacking DPS because we have no attack speed. The way that we'd fix this is by not going LDR and by going an attack speed item, right? But we're basically locked between a few options for an attack speed item. The Phantom Dancer line is kind of useless, so we kind of have to opt into more of the energized stuff, right? Which means that we're building this later on. However, this item builds out of a Noon Quiver, right? So Noon Quiver is really intrinsic to Samira's game plan because this allows you to actually get through the early lane phase and it procs your bloodline more frequently, right? The extra 20 damage that we get from this is affected by lifesteal, which is really, really solid for when you're just sitting there autoing minions. So if you start D-Blade, this is actually a nerf if you don't go Noon Quiver, and if you start something else, then it's an overall nerf as well because you're not able to proc your bloodline effectively, and Samira usually always gets kills in the early game, which do give you bloodline stacks. So now if we go for a little bit of attack speed here, you could see that our overall damage is basically about the same, but the speed at which we complete these items is going to be a huge hindrance. If we look at Collector has a price tag of 3k, right? And if we look at Stormrazor Stormraiser has a price tag of also 3k. However, this item is much more geared towards early game because the flat mix damage that it gives us, which is far significantly better early game, as well as the fact that it builds out a Noon Quiver, which is kind of a useless item, right, in the mid game. This item isn't worth as much, and the build path for this is a little bit more awkward than it is for Collector, so this is a harder item to complete overall. And then on top of that, we're forced to build Infinity Edge with this build path, which once again has an even higher price tag. So we're basically spending a whole bunch of gold for a really expensive build that doesn't really give us the option to make money in the early game, of course, right? Collector is really good if you're able to go for an all-in, but this is something that you would be winning anyways without Collector, right? The extra lethality isn't going to be what makes or breaks Samira in the lane. It's going to be the consistency of your support and whether or not you're able to actually output enough DPS on the enemy AD carry before they proc their lethal tempo or before they flash away, right? So this Collector build, in my opinion, is really not that great. There's a couple of ways for you to make it work. If you go like Collector into IE into BT, this is the most common one, which once again has 0 attack speed, which is kind of lame. And really slows you down. If you do like a full pen build like I'm seeing people doing, or if they're opting into shield bow like this is like the most average build that I see people do. You could see that it's really awkward to like actually go in for these auto Q autos, which will really slow down your damage, especially later game. Your goal as Samira isn't to actually dive into a fight as soon as it begins. It's to wait on the sideline, so that way people get out of position, so then you can dive into a fight and then blow them all up. So this Collector build kind of hurts you in the long run. It's okay for early game because it does give you a decent amount of damage, but you get more damage from going in one of the energized items. These items are completely overpowered and you have to be building them in 13.10. So in my opinion, the tier list for overall item builds are going to be energized items are at the very top, then right underneath that is the Gale Force itemization, and then underneath that is the lethality itemization. The reason why I rate Gale Force so high is for a multitude of reasons. Gale Force is an item that allows you to be super aggressive early game. It does grant you a little bit of attack speed, and it opens up a whole bunch of different build paths for you. If you want to do the shield bow build, then you can do this. And as you can see, we do end up doing significantly less damage to any tankier target, right? However, this is why we say this build for like 3 to 5 squishy enemy teammates, especially against priority targets, because we can do something like this. If we Q into auto EQ like so, you can see our total damage here is insane because of the Gale Force active. At a 6-item build to deal 874 damage, there's not a single AD carry in the game that's able to survive this. So on a tankier target, if we do the same thing, and we Q into Gale Force, auto into EQ like so, then you can see that our total damage is still pretty high, right? And of course, we're going to be getting our ulti off after this. So the positioning advantage that we have from this is super valuable. If you're able to use this effectively, this is going to be incredibly strong, but it's mostly for picking those squishier targets, right? This is for ADC in the late game. Let's say that this is an FLAce or something and he's sitting at very tip Q range. So if we max range Q into Gale Force auto EQ like before, and then we instantly go for ultimate. So you could see just how high our overall damage is going to be. This is a fantastic item for catching people out of position, and once again, we always have the active available to us, so if we end up getting jumped on, we can Gale backwards, so we can then dive into a fight later on, and then end up blowing up the entire backlane. This item just has a lot of utility and it's very strong, so in my personal opinion, the 3 best builds for Samira on this patch are going to end up being energized items, Gale Force underneath that, and then lethality underneath that. As far as overall DPS goes, it's going to be crit items are always at the top no matter what. Crit is just a superior stat. Then it'll be lethality under that, and then it'll be Gale Force under that. Gale Force is an item that once again has an active, so the way that you use it can increase your overall DPS, but if we're just going through a pure stat check, then yes, lethality will actually outdamage this, because lethality does have a little bit of a better curve, right? Gale Force is an item that doesn't really have a good mythic passive. It's kind of like a bad-ish slot, but you basically only build this item for the active anyways. It doesn't really matter the stats that it does end up giving you. It's just really strong and high elo. So now let's talk about one item damage. You can see here this is 1300. This dummy right here is 1300 HP with 50 armor, 50 MR, which is pretty average for a champion that's around level 9, you know. That's around like level 6 to 9, which is basically going to be where you're going to be finishing your first completed item. If we do the same thing with Gale Force, you can see our damage here is going to be really high, but we're generally going to be using this when somebody's about half HP. So if we auto Q, auto, and then we EQ Gale Force auto like so, you can see our damage is really high against a target like this. Now let's go to an energized build. We'll try Stormraiser here. Let's look at our total damage. There's going to be auto Q, auto E, auto Q, auto, like so. You can see our overall damage is a little bit higher than this, but it doesn't come out nearly as fast. Now let's swap to a Ghost Blade Bruce item. Auto Q, auto E, and then same combo. And we'll throw in the W because I forgot. You can see it's basically the same amount of damage, but we aren't critting at all. So the lack of crit is the severe weakness there. And then if we go Collector, which is lethality and crit, and we do the same thing, you can see that our damage is a little bit higher here because our opponent has lethality, right? However, our animations are a little bit slower, so it kind of makes up for it, right? The Collector Execute is kind of valuable in the early game, but this item overall just makes it really awkward to play, and it isn't really something that you should be opting into, in my opinion. This Storm Razor item gets stronger with the more items that you have, and of course crit is always going to be incredibly strong. The Collector build path kind of makes you a little bit weaker in terms of overall skirmishing, because you actually lose the positioning advantage. So while the damage is higher, it's kind of at a weird place. If you're against a super squishy team and you have like a Nautilus, then Collector is really good. Otherwise, the crit build is going to have a more flat power curve, which feels a lot nicer to play with because you'll have a lot of attack speed in the early game. So you'll actually be able to get your ulti off when you don't have a reset, and so on and so forth. This Collector build only gets weaker as the game progresses. And as you can see, it's really awkward to try and go for these cancels using this build. Whereas if we build Storm Razor or Shiv, this item helps us through the early game because it has Noon Quiver, and then on top of that, the Energized Attack and Attack Speed make up for that kind of loss of damage that we get from not having the Collector's lethality. You could see this is even with me missing an auto on this other dummy here, that we're basically the same amount of damage. Let's go again. We're basically the same exact amount of damage, but we have a nicer power curve, essentially. So when it comes to itemization, in my opinion, opt into a Noon Quiver item. The energized items are just simply too strong this patch. Even if they receive any hefty nerfs, it's not really going to matter too much because you build them for the first item utility. You don't really build them for the... You build them primarily for the first item utility, but because they are a crit item, they actually do have some of the best scaling as well, which will then, of course, grant you the best late game potential. Most games end around 3 items. Your 3 item spike with this build is going to be significantly stronger than it is going to be with any other build, simply because of the amount of DPS that you're able to pump out. It is always an ADC's job to pump out as much DPS as possible, and you could see that we're able to pump a decent amount onto a target with armor and a lot of HP with absolutely 0 pen. You can see we completely melt this. If we do the Ghostblade build, we're going to be losing out on significantly more damage. You can see just how awkward it is to kind of play with this reduced amount of attack speed as well. If we do the Ghostblade build and we go full lethality, wait for the passive to be up, and then we do the same combo, you can see we're doing about the same amount of damage. However, it's a lot harder to get off, and we're not critting, right? And this does reduce our crit slots in the late game. So instead of us having 80% crit, we'll have 60, which is overall a nerf for our damage. And then if we go if we do the Gale Force build, you can see that this is going to be the least amount of damage unless we have the active up, and even still, it's going to be pretty low. But once again, this is assassination potential and repositioning, so we're able to get more damage off later on into a fight. So anyways, that basically sums it up. The lethality builds are straight up inferior to going usually just a standard crit build. If you want to go collect your first item, you can. It's a situational item, but in my opinion, it's going to be a lot worse if you're actually going to be playing Samira properly. If you're going to be dashing in and just like trying to trade 1 for 1, then it's completely fine to go that build. However, I don't have that same playstyle. I like to sit on the edge of a fight and like wait to go off and then like get multi-kill. So for me personally, the collector build I think is really bad. The Ghostblade build is completely terrible just because the item stats aren't that great. Even if you go collector first into Ghostblade, it's kind of a waste of a slot because, once again, it doesn't give us crit chance, and crit chance is a must on this champion simply because of the unique scaling on Q and R with Critical Strike, as well as the innate scaling with Infinity Edge. Infinity Edge will just straight up always be our highest damage item, basically no matter what build that we do, and it only goes up as the game continues. As you can see here, we're doing a huge amount of damage compared to the lethality build on this dummy. We dealt a grand total of like 800 more, which is, you know, pretty much as it goes. If you're ever able to get off multiple Qs or you're ulting in the middle of a fight and you have Infinity Edge, you will always deal more damage because mathematically Samira is coded that way. The Gale Force build is still the build that I think is my favorite, simply because it is the most skill expressive and it allows me to have the most influence in the game. AD carry obviously has very low agency, so Gale Force kind of helps you bring that agency up, and then you can fish for more 1v1s in the lane phase when the supports are roaming or they're like looking to go for like Drake fight or something, you can always pick somebody using Gale Force. Being able to Gale onto somebody and get yourself in range is also half the battle on this champion, and especially in higher elos, because most people do understand that Samira is very low range and they respect her range. It's impossible to respect Samira's range if she does Gale Force into auto EQ like so, and then they'll have to flash and you just simply flash after them. It's the most free kill in the history of the universe. So to me, this item is really strong just for snowballing the game and if you play well. And that about sums it up. The energized items are always going to be the best because not only do you get a good item for the early game that helps you CS and whatnot with the Noon Quiver, you also get to build into IE. The Ghostblade build is really low tier, simply because lethality is not a good stat on this champion. Unless it's combined with crit, which is not really super possible anymore because of the removal of Infinity Edge. Lethality crits were the highest damage you could ever get before, when you could get Infinity Edge plus lethality, but you can't do that now. The collector first item is really good if you have a consistent support or if you're playing with a duo queue. I would recommend that, but basically every other build is like kind of irrelevant. And doesn't really offer the same amount of utility. This is just, of course, my early opinions on the patch. I've only had like 2.5 days to test this out. I've played a lot of Samira games, but I've also been playing a lot of Jhin lately, and it's very apparent when you look at like the high-low meta that the energized items are just completely and utterly broken. Jhin is, of course, a special use case for the energized items, so, you know, he has higher AD, and of course, the Stormrazor has a high AD scaling. So Jhin is like one of the best winners of the patch, but most champions that are crit follow the same power curve where it's like energized items, then it's like lethality crit, and then under that it's any Gale Force items unless you're a Phelios. But anyways, thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. The uploads will resume as normal. I hope that you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys in the next one.